Breaking news from college football. No surprise, really. Florida State has dropped out of the AP Top 25 after losing its first two games. The Seminoles are just the third team from preseason top 10 to unranked in the first regular season poll since the AP rankings expanded to 25 back in 1989. So Florida State is out. Here is how things look heading into week 2. Texas up to number 3 behind number 1 Georgia and second-ranked Ohio State. Alabama up a spot, and Notre Dame jumps 2 after that big win over Texas A&M. Meanwhile, Oregon drops 4 spots to number 7 after struggling to beat FCS foe Idaho. And Clemson, believe it or not, still hanging on to a spot. They are number 25 despite that blowout loss to the Bulldogs in Atlanta. Plenty to discuss, and so to do so, we bring in our college football analyst, Douzable. Let's start at the top here, because I think the biggest not surprise is Georgia remaining number 1. You like the fit there to stay?
So dominant. To take on a Clemson team who a lot of people, and if you look at the history of Clemson, they've always done really good against AP number 1 teams. I mean, obliterated them the second half. I mean, that game wasn't even close, Haley. The way that they were so dominant, not only on offense with Carson Beck being able to spread the football around and them also be able to run the ball effectively, but how dominant that defense was. I mean, Malachi Starks, that interception, it was out of this world, right? For him to go in trail position, one hand, go up and intercept the ball. Their defensive line with Micah Williams, they continue to be dominant as well. So I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. They played one of the highest ranked teams and made them look like they were a little league team. So like when you do that and you embarrass a team on the national stage, you stay at the number 1 spot.
You know, this game was interesting too, because I mean, first quarter wrapped up, it was 0-0, and then you started to see Georgia sort of catch their stride. What'd you think of Carson Beck? And you know, there's a lot of expectations for him. He returns for his last year in college. What'd you make of his performance?
Well, to me, he was just efficient at the quarterback position. And a lot of times at the quarterback position, your job is to get it into the hands of the playmakers. Don't do anything out of this world. We don't need you to do anything out of ordinary. Just find your playmakers and get it to them. Like right here, right? This is a dump off to the running back. And that's a 20-plus yard play, Haley. So it's just like being efficient with the football. Sometimes you don't have to do a whole bunch of off-script stuff. Just find your playmakers out in space and allow them to make plays for you. And that's exactly what he's done last year, and that's what he continues to do this year.
Well, good thing for Georgia fans, they got a big test coming up this week, taking on Tennessee Tech. I couldn't even say it with a straight face. But we do actually have a big test in this next conversation we're going to have here. Texas and Michigan. Ooh. Michigan has not lost a home game in 25 games, but as we talked to our Josh Pate earlier today, as well as a couple of our other college football insiders, that streak could be in jeopardy here.
For sure.
What are your initial impressions of this matchup?
Well, they're actually a home dog in this game, right? And I think there's question marks at the quarterback position with Davis Warren, right? He's the heir apparent to J.J. McCarthy leaving, and there were some struggles on the offensive side of the ball. If it wasn't for Superman, and that's why I call him Will Johnson at corner, Fresno State had an opportunity late in that game to potentially tie that game and push that game into overtime. So when you look at this game, I can't wait to see that man on the screen right there. Isaiah Bond versus that guy, Superman. You see it right there. That was the pick six that solidified the game for the Michigan Wolverine. Like, that is going to be must-watch TV this weekend. Isaiah Bond, who made his debut for Texas and looked really good. They handed him an end around. He had 20-plus yards on that. Believe he had over 70 yards receiving versus that guy who a lot of people say is the number 1 corner in all of college football, Will Johnson. I can't wait to see that matchup.
You think Michigan's on upset watch?
I'm taking Texas with them. I think they're favored 7.5 points. And this kind of reminds me of last year. People were saying, could Texas play that physical brand of football when they went into Alabama? Well, Haley, they kicked the door down, laid on the couch, got their snacks, put their feet up on the coffee table, and made themselves at home. I look for Texas to do the same thing versus Michigan this year.
Yeah, that game against Alabama seems like it was so far ago, but that's when really you put Texas on the map.
Correct.
Texas is potentially back. We'll leave that to the faithful to decide. Let's talk Tennessee at NC State. Tennessee, of course, moved up to number 14. NC State remains at number 24. This game is interesting, Lige. It's a neutral site, so you know you really don't have that home field advantage necessarily. But when we talk Tennessee, this is a Josh Heupel-led program that's just been up and up and up each and every year. So when you're facing off against NC State here, what's the expectation for Tennessee?
Well, when you're Tennessee, right, and you're playing a team like NC State, they're always going to play really good defense, but they actually struggled last week versus Western Carolina. And if honestly it wasn't for the NC State offense and the way that Grayson McCall, who was a transfer from Coastal Carolina, played, NC State might have been in trouble last week versus Western Carolina. The Tennessee Josh Heupel offense is always going to be explosive, and their new quarterback, Nico Iamaleava, was out of this world in the first half. I mean, Haley, 5 touchdown passes, over 300 yards. And he only played in one half.
Yeah.
Right? He was super efficient with the football. Tennessee Volunteers fans have been waiting for this kid to take over the starting reins, and he did not disappoint in his debut. So that will be my question mark. Will this NC State defense be able to keep up not only with the explosive ability of this Tennessee offense, but also the tempo that they play with? I went to UCF. Josh Heupel was at UCF. The way that they run plays, Haley, you might get 90 plays in a game. So you definitely have to be conditioned if you're NC State in that defense, and you have to communicate because they go up-tempo on the ball.
Yeah, Nico Iamaleava. We've been practicing saying his name because we're going to say it quite a bit this year. He is in the top 10 when it comes to quarterbacks, thanks to our partners over at 24/7 Sports, so someone to keep your eye on. If we switch over and talk Big 12 football, you've got Utah taking on Baylor. It's technically a conference game,
Correct.
but because it was an ad before Utah was joined the Big 12, I should say, it is not considered a conference game. But the point remains, Utah stays at number 11 after a big win over Southern Utah. When you think about the expectations for Utah, they're the favorites to win the new look Big 12
Correct.
this year. They've got a quarterback who's played football for 100 years at this point. Give us some realistic expectations now that we're getting into the meat of the season here.
I mean, realistic expectations is this team should be competing for a college football playoff spot, not only because they're most likely going to win the Big 12, but because they're a really good team. You talk about the experience with Cam Rising and Haley.
All the experience.
Literally, we've had this discussion before. When you look at teams that have made a run to the college football playoffs, it's usually because at the quarterback position, there's some familiarity and continuity. Well, you stated it, Haley. Nobody has more familiarity or continuity than Cam Rising. And he was amazing in the Southern Utah game, right? 254 pass yards, 5 passing touchdowns, all in the first half. Didn't even play the second half. So this is a team that can put up points. They always have been tough on the defensive side. So this is a team that has aspirations to go to the college football playoffs, not just because they're the favorites in the Big 12. It's because they're one of the best 12 teams in the nation right now.
Yeah, a reminder as well, and we'll keep reminding, the college football playoff has now expanded.
Correct.
So there's plenty more opportunities for some of the teams like Utah to get in. So we're excited to see them. Let's talk biggest movers here when it comes to the AP. No one moved more spots than USC. They're now up to 13, 10 spots after that big win over the weekend. What impressed you about USC and this victory?
I want to give a shout out to Miller Moss, the quarterback, but I'm a defensive guy, so I got to go to the defensive side of the ball. Haley, people tend to forget this USC defense was abysmal last year. Literally, Caleb Williams would have to go out there and put up 50 burgers for them to win. Well, they brought in my guy, D'Anthony Lynn, Eric Henderson on the defensive side, and I saw a USC team hit and run in space that I hadn't seen since Pete Carroll was there. That's how good they played versus LSU. I mean, those linebackers and safeties were tackling in space, and that's very hard to do when an offensive player has enough room where he can make a movement on you and for you to bring that guy down. That's not what we saw last year from this USC defense. So want to give a shout out to the defensive side because I think that's the reason why the USC team could be a sneaky team for the college football playoffs because of the defense. Now, Miller Moss, I mean, just picked off right where he left off from the bowl game where he had 6 touchdown passes. Very efficient. And with the game on the line, Haley, that 2-hole shot in cover 2 to get them into field goal range, and then they end up scoring anyway, the touchdown. But I thought he was poised when they needed him the most. And for a first-year starter, it seems like they have found their guy of the future in Miller Ross. There's a reason why Caleb Williams went to bat for him, saying this guy should be the future at USC.
Let me ask you this before we move on to our biggest losers of the weekend. Our guys earlier on HQ saying that USC went from being, just in the Big Ten to now we're contending for a Big Ten championship potentially. How do you feel?
I'm so glad you asked me that question, Haley, because that was my biggest question mark for them going into the season. Would they be able to withstand the physical rigors of the Big Ten? If you know the Big Ten, they like to run the football. Teams like Wisconsin, Penn State, right, Ohio State, Michigan, we're going to run the football. Would USC, coming from the West Coast, coming from the former, Pac-12, would they be able to withstand the rigors of the physicality that the Big Ten brings? Well, they showed versus LSU, an SEC team, that this defense can play up to standard. And we know that with Lincoln Riley as the not only head coach but offensive coordinator, they're going to be able to put up points.
Yeah, they just made things a lot more interesting, especially with how Oregon played over the weekend. We don't have time to get into that, but we do have time to get into Clemson, barely holding on to a spot here. They check in at number 25, holding on to that last point. Is this deserved for Clemson after what you saw in Atlanta?
You don't get embarrassed like that on national TV. Now, again, there is an asterisk, right? I want to preface this by saying Georgia is clearly the #1 cut team in the NFL, in college football.
They could play in the NFL.
Yeah, literally, they maybe could play in the NFL, but the thing is, you just cannot get embarrassed like that. And the thing is, with Cade Klubnik, right, everybody was waiting for him to take that eventual step, and we just have not seen it, right? It seems like sometimes he doesn't process as well. When he should throw the ball, he doesn't. When guys are open, he doesn't throw the football. So you stated, Haley, in the first quarter, there was a game, even going into the second quarter, but it seemed like the Clemson defense finally wore down, and that's what happens, right? When your offense continues to go 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out, have to punt the ball back, eventually your defense is going to wear down, and that's what happened with Clemson. And Dabo Swinney has been publicly scrutinized for not going into the transfer portal and not, I want to say adhering, but not following the trends of what college football is in today. It bit him in the butt versus this game because we know Georgia will go into the transfer portal and get some of the top players in the nation. So it'll be really interesting, kind of like Florida State has struggled these last 2 games, to see where Clemson goes from here. Does this game from this last week really affect them? They have a big game at home this week versus App State.
Glad you brought up Florida State because that's where we are wrapping things up. They are obviously no longer a part of the the AP top 25, I should say, after back-to-back losses in games that they should have won. I mean, Lige, when you look at Florida State, it's almost like the football gods were like, listen, we know that we did you wrong last year. You didn't make it into the college football playoffs, so we're going to do you solid. We're going to give you the international game to open up the week, and that should be a win. And then we're going to give you a Monday night game because that should also be a win. And yet they went out and lost both of theirs. What's wrong with the Seminoles?
I think first and foremost, there was too much hype about this team going into the offseason. Now, again, as a head coach, Mike Norvell, you're supposed to hype up your team, right? But when you look at this team, the turnover on it, right? So many players lost in the NFL. And we've seen teams that have had success in college football or even had success going to the college football playoff have that continuity and familiarity. Well, this is a whole new team on offense, right? And then when you look at this team, they just get beat up in the trenches, Haley. I can't remember seeing any of that last year, right? Obviously, they had they had a first-round pick and a second-round pick on that defensive line, but that defensive line is losing the war in the trenches week in and week out, and that is not what you're accustomed to seeing from a Florida State team. So when you see Mike Norvell and you saw him post press conference, one thing that worries me is he just seems deflated, right? Yeah. And as a head coach, again, you're not going to be happy after taking a butt whipping like that. But again, people made fun of, Brian Kelly, but I love that he showed energy, at least in that press conference. When you look at Mike Norvell, your team is watching that press conference. They see that you're deflated. What does that do for the energy in that locker room? Like, who are the leaders stepping up also in that locker room? Where Florida State had so many leaders last year, whether it was Jared Verse or Jordan Travis. Like, who is the guy stepping up and saying, guys, we need to get this thing together? Didn't really see that on the sideline, so I don't know where they go from here.
Who was the bigger loser, Clemson or Florida State?
Florida State, without a doubt. And honestly, we were having this discussion, Haley. Even though they were ranked, in week 0 and going into week 1, I thought the AP should have had a meeting of the minds and took them out of the top 10. I thought it was utterly ridiculous for them to still have a number 10 there going into week 1 after they I don't want to say got embarrassed by Georgia Tech because it was a close game, but the score wasn't indicative of how that game really went. Like, they lost the physical battle in both of these games. So they deserve to be out of the top 25. And honestly, they probably would have dropped all the way to like 22 or 23 if this game happened in week 2, but it happened in week 1 because they had an extra game and they played in week 0. But yeah, they have to go from square one. A lot of those players and coaches are going to have to look themselves in the mirror to dig themselves out of this hole.
The good news is it's only week 2, so we've got plenty of season left to play, but certainly a couple of those teams are going to have to step their game up if they want to get back into the AP Top 25. He's Lige Douzable, bringing us all things college football news. The new AP 25 means that we've got some new rankings in terms of our notable games going into week 2, I should say. Of course, at the top of that list, Texas at Michigan. That's ranked on ranked action. We also have the Cy-Hawk game, Iowa State, Iowa. Lige, when you look at this list, which game jumps out to you?
So there's a couple. Oregon did drop 4 spots. Boise State is actually undefeated against Oregon in the times they've played. So that'll be a really good game. Ashton Jeanty went off last week versus Georgia Southern, over 260 yards. So I'm looking to see how Dan Lanning and his team bounces back after having a not-so-good outing versus Idaho. And then Colorado, Nebraska, that's another rival game. Like, I'm excited to see that. Dylan Raiola showed out in his debut in week 1, and Shedeur Sanders and the Colorado Buffaloes, escaped beating North Dakota State late in that game.
Yeah, that was a crazy one. Of course, neither of those teams ranked just yet, but we will have to see how the season unfolds. And don't forget, the Cover 3 podcast is your place to go when you are looking for all things college football inside. Our crew keeps you up to date with all the latest. They have so much fun on the podcast between power rankings, their big game of the week, and so much more. Make sure you scan that QR code or listen in to the Cover 3 wherever you get your podcasts.